Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Alan F. Estevez of the District of Columbia to be Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Alan F. Estevez of the District of Columbia to be Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense shall be brought to a close? The ayes and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Beckidge, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp,
Aye.
Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota,
Aye. Thanks.
Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Fitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Ms. Leahy. Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Blumenthal, Cardin, Enzi, Heitkamp, Johnson of Wisconsin, Leahy, Nelson, Schatz, and Udall of New Mexico. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Coons, aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray? Aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Toomey? Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Isaacson? Aye. Mr. Alexander? Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Chambliss? Aye. Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? No. Mr. Kane? Aye. Mr. Crapo? No. Sessions? Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Coates? Aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? Aye. Mr. Vitter? Aye. Mr. Wicker? Aye. Mr. Franken? Mr. Franken? Aye. Mr. Johans? Aye. Mr. Barrasso? Aye. Mr. Lee? Aye.
Yes. That's what I said. I go up there. I do.
Mrs. Fisher? Aye.
I'll see. Do that a lot. Well, they swung. I don't think they're. It's against. I think we might
Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye.
start cooking up here.
Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? No.
Yeah, chopping board.
Mr. Chiesa? Aye.
Yeah. Cut to birds, right? Making an omelet.
Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey? Aye.
Oh, yeah, well, you know.
Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Corker? Aye. Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye.
really.
Mr. Harkin? Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Scott, no. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. McCain? Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. McConnell? Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mr. Flake, aye. Mr. Rubio, no. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Donnelly? Mr. Donnelly, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Cruz? Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Levin, aye. Ms. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Baucus? Mr. Baucus, aye. All right. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Ms. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Cochran, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Beckidge. Mr. Beckidge, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the ayes are 91, the nays are 8. 3/5 of the Senate duly chosen and sworn have voted in the affirmative, and the motion is agreed to.
Pursuant to the provisions of S. Resolution 15 of the 113th Congress, there will now be up to 8 hours of post-cloture consideration of the nomination, equally divided in the usual form.
I ask unanimous consent, Madam
Senator from
President.
Alaska.
I ask unanimous consent that at 12 noon today, all
The Senate will be in
post-cloture
order.
time on the Estevez nomination be yielded back and the Senate proceed to a vote on the nomination without intervening action or debate. The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order, that any related statements be printed in the record, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Without objection.
For the information of all Senators, we expect a voice vote on the Estevez confirmation. The next vote in order will be cloture on the Archuleta nomination, so Senators should expect a roll call vote at noon. Okay. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Republican Whip.
Madam President, I know we are on the post-cloture time on the Estevez nomination, and I wanted to explain why it was necessary for me to put a hold on this nomination this last March for a very important position as the second-ranking acquisition official at the Department of Defense. Actually, my objection doesn't have anything to do with Mr. Estevez personally, who I trust will do an admirable job in this very important position. But the reason I put a hold on the nomination was so I could try to get the Department of Defense's attention to protest their...
Senate will be in order.
I did so, Madam President, in order to protest the Department of Defense's business relationship with a notorious Russian arms dealer. For the last few years, the Pentagon's been buying helicopters, Mi-17 helicopters, from Rosoboron Export, a Russian arms dealer, to supply the Afghan military. But this is the same arms dealer, of course, that is supplying Bashar al-Assad with the weapons he's using in Syria in that civil war to kill his own innocent population, innocent civilians. The Pentagon itself has confirmed that Bashar al-Assad security force have used these very same Russian-made weapons to massacre untold number of civilians. And yet the Department of Defense has stubbornly refused, and I don't think arrogant is too strong a word, stubbornly and arrogantly refused to end its relationship with Assad's personal arms supplier. In fact, since 2011, the Pentagon has given more than $1 billion to Rosoboron Export in no-bid contracts, and it's planning to spend another $345 million on the company's Mi-17 helicopters in 2014. Let me be clear, Madam President. By purchasing Mi-17s from Rosoboron Export, our own Department of Defense is effectively subsidizing the mass murder of Syrian civilians, which is, by all accounts, simply outrageous. To make matters worse, the Mi-17 program is apparently plagued by internal corruption. According to published news reports, there are at least 2 separate ongoing criminal investigations into the U.S. Army office that manages the procurement and sustainment contracts for the Mi-17s. Last month, I joined 31 of my congressional colleagues in a bipartisan letter to the Attorney General of the United States, urging him to utilize all available resources to support these criminal investigations. For that matter, I've also joined with 12 of my Senate colleagues in a bipartisan letter to General Dempsey, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon, asking him for assurances that its contracts with Rosoboron Export are not being abused by corrupt Russian officials. Americans have good reason to be concerned. After all, it's their tax dollars that are being used to buy these helicopters from Russia for the Afghan military. But Russia has a particularly bad track record. They've received an abysmal grade of D- in Transparency International's latest Government Defense Anti-Corruption Index. Back in 2011, Russia's chief military prosecutor publicly stated that 20% of his country's annual military equipment budget is being stolen by corrupt officials and contractors. One independent watchdog believes that figure could be as high as 40%. In short, there are plenty of legitimate reasons and questions about exactly why American tax dollars are going to Rosoboron export. On a per-aircraft basis, the U.S. Army is paying Rosoboron export more than double what the Russian military itself is paying to buy nearly identical helicopters. About a year ago, I convinced the Pentagon to conduct a formal audit of the Army's 2011 no-bid contract. Unfortunately, that audit went nowhere due to persistent stonewalling by, you guessed it, Rosoboron export. In other words, we still have a lot of questions, and the Pentagon and Rosoboron exports still owe us a lot of answers, which we don't yet have. But here's one question. What prompted the Department of Defense to buy Russian helicopters in the first place? To my knowledge, there are plenty of American manufacturers of helicopters that would be anxious to compete for this no-bid contract. By relying upon Moscow to supply the Afghan military with essential equipment, we've given the Kremlin significant leverage over U.S. foreign policy. Moreover, equipping the Afghans with Russian helicopters will make it virtually impossible to achieve any real level of interoperability between the U.S. and Afghan helicopter fleets. The Department of Defense has repeatedly and disingenuously claimed that a 2010 study of Afghanistan's helicopter requirements shows the necessity of buying Mi-17 helicopters from Russia. In fact, the unclassified portion of that study found that the ideal aircraft for the Afghan military was a particular American-made helicopter. So why are we buying Russian helicopters when there are American manufacturers that can meet that very same requirement? It makes no sense whatsoever, and the Department of Defense has steadfastly refused to cooperate with reasonable inquiries into why in the world they continue to persist along this pathway. The reality is the Department of Defense has plenty of alternatives to buying Mi-17s from Russia, but has, for some reason or reasons known only to them, steadfastly refused to seriously consider any of these alternatives. The most sensible and cost-effective alternative would involve keeping many of the Mi-17s the Afghans already have on hand and life extending them instead of retiring them early, which is what's happening now. In other words, Mi-17s that the Afghans already have are being retired early rather than being life extended because of the Pentagon's stubborn insistence on buying new ones to replace these existing helicopters with. And in fact, a majority of the Mi-17s the Afghan military already has have more than half of their useful life time left in terms of flight hours, and they're being retired early so the Pentagon can buy these new helicopters to replace them. Makes no sense whatsoever, particularly at a time when I know we're all concerned about our defense expenditures and making sure that the Defense Department has the resources they need in order to keep America safe and maintain our commitments around the world. Why in the world would the Defense Department be acting so irresponsibly as they are in the purchase of these Mi-17 helicopters? So, Madam President, while I don't have any personal objection to the nomination of Mr. Alan Estevez, I could not support cloture on the nomination. So along with my friends and colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I'm going to continue to do everything I can to shine a bright light on the Pentagon's troubling relationship with this Russian arms dealer, which is also Bashar al-Assad's arms dealer, from whom he purchases weapons to kill innocent civilians in Syria. What reasonable person wouldn't be troubled by this tangled relationship? Ideally, the MI-17 program would simply be terminated. At the very least, it should be placed on constant and vigorous congressional oversight, and that would serve the interests of U.S. taxpayers and U.S. national security alike. So, Madam President, for all of these reasons, I could not support the cloture vote on the nomination of Mr. Estevez, and I'm going to continue to come back to the floor and to use other vehicles. I see the distinguished chairman of the Armed Services Committee on the floor. I know we're going to be taking up the defense authorization bill later on this year, and I'll be reaching out to him and other colleagues on both sides of the aisle to try to bring an end to this troubling relationship with Rosoboron Export and to seek alternative means, hopefully from American manufacturers, for this requirement for the Afghan military. Madam President, I'd ask unanimous consent to append to the record following my remarks two letters, one dated August the 5th, 2013, to General Martin E. Dempsey. The second, which I referred to in my remarks, a letter dated September the 16th, 2013, addressed to the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder.
Without objection.
Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Michigan.
First, on behalf of Senator Menendez, I'd ask unanimous consent that Christopher Landberg, a detailee from the State Department to the Foreign Relations Committee, be granted floor privileges for the consideration of the nomination of Jacob Lew.
Without objection.
Madam President, I very much support the nomination of Alan Estevez to be Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Mr. Estevez is a career civil servant who has served under presidents of both political parties since 1981, when he started work at the Military Traffic Management Command. Over the last 30 years, Mr. Estevez has developed an expertise in military logistics, eventually rising to become the first career federal official to hold the position of Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Material Readiness, a position to which he provides civilian oversight for more than $190 billion of the DoD logistics operations. He previously played a key role in re-engineering Department of Defense transportation processes and in helping to address logistics deficiencies identified during Operation Desert Shield. Mr. Estevez is the recipient of the 2010 Presidential Rank Distinguished Executive Award and the 2006 Presidential Rank Meritorious Executive Award, 2 Office of the Secretary of Defense Medals for Meritorious Civilian Service, and the 2005 Service to America Medal awarded by the Partnership for Public Service. And so he's extremely well qualified for this position, Madam President. I'm glad that we have now achieved cloture so that his nomination can be voted on, I understand, at noon. I don't know of opposition to him and his personal qualifications. I understand the debate over the helicopter issue, which he is not the one who ordered, nor can he reverse. So that issue is an issue which has been raised by a number of senators, including the senator from Texas. Senator Blumenthal has raised it in committee as well. The letter, I understand, that went out to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs has not yet been answered. However, I've spoken to General Dunford about this matter, and I'll have more to say about that when this issue is raised, either on the defense authorization bill or on some other matter. But for the time being, let me say that simply that helicopter is a requirement which has been set by our generals, not by our Pentagon people, civilians. It is a top priority that the Afghans be supplied that helicopter because it's the one that they have flown. The Army of Afghanistan has used that helicopter. And so without getting into the merits of this, because this is left for a later time, by the senator from Texas, and I am grateful for that the debate can not be connected to the Estevez nomination, where it really has no relevance since he didn't set the requirement, nor can he reverse the decision, but it will be set for a later time, hopefully after the senators receive the answer to the letter that they sent to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I very strongly support the Estevez nomination and look forward to a confirmation vote, either a voice vote or a roll call vote if necessary at noon. And I thank the presiding officer.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate approves the nomination of Alan Estevez to be Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics. They're in a quorum call. We're going to take you over now live to the Conference Committee. House and Senate budget conferees are meeting and have been meeting since about 10 o'clock this morning on moving forward with the 2014 budget. Live coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
Everyone recognizes that we need to come together and find the consensus and the common ground between us as we move forward. Senator Wyden mentioned that we should turn the current crisis into consensus, and we have that opportunity. I think it's important that we recognize some of the facts that we have to deal with as we achieve that. I've started to hear talk, not among us here, but I've started to hear talk recently that we don't really have a debt crisis anymore, that the Congress has been responsible in the past few years. We've passed $2.5 trillion of the $4 trillion that we needed to achieve, and that we are well on our way now to climbing out of the problem that we face. Well, the reality is that we do still have a debt crisis. The $2.5 trillion that is talked about is essentially made up of about $500 or $600 billion of tax increases, and a Budget Control Act that was passed in the face of the last fiscal crisis in 2011 that requires Congress to stick to that budget for 10 years. Anybody who has watched Congress and budgets knows that the record Congress has in sticking to its budget is deplorable. And one of the things that I think we ought to focus on is making sure that this $2.5 trillion that we all talk about is maintained. We have actually, and I think remarkably, stayed to that budget for the last couple of years, to the Budget Control Act. And as a result of that, at least with regard to discretionary spending, we are now starting to bend the curve down. And as I understand it, we are actually, if we stay on this course, going to be spending less in real dollars, not inflation-adjusted dollars, but less in real dollars in this fiscal year than we have in just a few years past. A remarkable achievement, but one that must be maintained. And I think as we talk about how to move forward, one of the first objectives we should have here in this conference is to protect and assure the reality of the fiscal reforms that we already have in place. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about focusing not just on some of the numbers in the budget and the spending, but focusing on some processes. I think one of the best things this committee could do is to establish some processes to help us move forward and assure and protect the existing achievements that have been made, budget enforcement processes that will help us assure that Congress sticks to the agreements that it does make on the budget, and then set forward some processes to help us move into the larger, what has been called grand bargains. I know that we don't have the time in this committee to put together the kind of large deal that would involve the tax reform, the entitlement reform, the fiscal reform, and the budget enforcement reform that all of us know needs to be done. But we can set up some processes to help us assure that the tax reform that we all talk about and are working on does move forward and move forward promptly. Processes that assure that Congress will not break its budget, as it has almost a perfect record of doing. Processes that will help us deal with future lapses in spending and potential government shutdowns in the way that Senator Portman's bill and others have proposed, to help us get a functioning and smoother process to deal with these crisis points that we seem to lurch between. Processes to help us deal with the debt ceiling as we reach the debt ceiling, and hopefully help us reduce the stress that we put on our economy in the political battles that we have here. I believe that we have a remarkable opportunity to focus on fixing some of the rules, some of the processes by which we function in this Congress in a way that will help us increase our ability to save to protect the savings that we now have and to achieve further and greater savings as we move forward. So I would just encourage, as we work on all the other parts of the budget and all the other parts of the fiscal reform that are necessary, that we focus on laying the foundation for much greater and more effective results as we move forward beyond the activities of this committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Sanders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Murray. And I think this has been a very good discussion, and I hope that we can continue to have more open discussions, because I think there are a lot of good ideas around this room. But let me begin my remarks with a radical proposal, if I might, and that is, let's listen to what the American people are telling us. You know, when we're at a 10% favorability rating, it might be a pretty good idea to do that. And what are the American people telling us? In poll after poll after poll, what they are saying is, do not cut Social Security, do not cut Medicare, do not cut Medicaid. That's what all the polls are telling us. The last one is the National Journal, tells us 81% of the American people do not want to cut Medicare benefits at all. 76% of the American people do not want to cut Social Security benefits at all, and 60% of the American people do not want to cut Medicaid benefits at all. Second of all, what else are the American people telling us? They say, yeah, deficit is a serious issue. And as Senator Crapo indicated, and I think we all know, we have made some progress in recent years. We've cut the deficit in half, not bad. And the American people want us to continue to do that. But you know what else they want us to do? In every poll that I have seen, you know what the top issue is? It is the economy and it is jobs. Representative Black made a good point. Real unemployment in this country is not 7.4%. It is close to 14% if you include those people who have given up looking for work and are working part-time when they want to work full-time. Youth unemployment, and the Pope, by the way, new Pope talks about this a lot. Youth unemployment is close to 20%. African-American youth unemployment is over 40%. And you know what the American people tell us in polls? They say, invest in the economy, create the millions of jobs that we need. Use government funds to rebuild our infrastructure. That is what the American people are telling us. And I think all of this comes from a fact that we do not talk about enough, and certainly the media doesn't talk about enough, is the American people look out. What do they see in the economy today? They see a middle class disappearing. 46.5 million people living in poverty. That is the highest we have ever been, while the wealthiest people in this country and the largest corporations are doing phenomenally well. So when the American people look around and talk about the deficit in jobs, what do they say? They say, do not balance the budget on the backs of the most vulnerable people in this country, the elderly, the children, the sick, working families, and the poor. But you know what they also say in polls, in town meetings that I do, and I expect that you do? They say when the top 1% in the last few years have received 95% of all new income, you know what they say? Ask the millionaires and billionaires to pay a little bit more in taxes. Ain't going to hurt them. And you know what also they say? When we have record-breaking profits in corporate America, when Wall Street that we bailed out a few years ago is now doing phenomenally well, when 1 out of 4 major corporations in this country does not pay a nickel in taxes, then maybe it might be time to ask some of these large, profitable corporations who in some years pay nothing in federal income taxes to start paying their fair share. Who in this room is going to defend a situation where we lose $100 billion a year because multinational corporations are parking their profits in the Cayman Islands and in Bermuda and not paying a nickel in federal income taxes? Anyone think that's a particularly good idea? Senator Grassley raised a point a few moments ago about the defense budget. We are now spending almost as much as the rest of the world on defense. And we're not fighting the Soviet Union, we're fighting al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, the Department of Defense can't even give us an audit. Does anyone here think we really can't cut money in the Defense Department? So I think if we look at a moral solution and good economic sense, I think we can do deficit reduction. I think we've got to do that. But I think we've also got to create the millions of jobs that the American people understand we need to create. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield the floor.
Right. Thank you. Senator Graham.
I like Senator Sanders, but I disagree with virtually everything he said. And that brings us to what we're trying to do here, reconcile his worldview with mine. And they're different. It's like we're on different political planets here, but what is the nature of the problem? I mean, either we have almost a $17 trillion debt.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I come to the floor today to speak on 2 separate and distinct matters relating to the military, and I ask unanimous consent that they be separated in the reproduction.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. No one in this body other than I had the privilege to know Justin Eldridge of Waterford, Connecticut. Justin was a true American hero, a patriot, a United States Marine who served our country in Afghanistan and who scarcely more than 48 hours ago took his own life at his home. My thoughts and prayers are with Justin's wife, Joanna, and their 4 children, and all of Justin's family and friends, fellow Marines, who grieve his loss at this difficult time. I first came to know Justin when he formed a chapter of the Marine Corps League in southeastern Connecticut. He believed deeply in the Marine Corps, in service to his country, his family, and in the values and traditions and ethos of all of our great United States Marines and men and women who wear the uniform. Yesterday, Justin Eldridge lost his own battle, a long battle with post-traumatic stress that he fought heroically after serving in the Marine Corps for 8.5 years before his medical retirement in 2008. Even after he returned home from Afghanistan, Justin had a long fight ahead of him. he returned home with the signature wounds of this war, both traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. And he worked for years to get the specialized treatment that he needed. He tried hard to be there for his family. According to his wife, Joanna, his 4 children loved having him around. And he faced another all-too common problem in this country: health care at the Veterans Administration and accessing the care that he needed. He needed specialized treatment at the VA, and the VA originally told him he'd have to wait 2 weeks to get it. But he reached out to my office, and my staff did all that we could to get him to the hospital more quickly. He was admitted to the VA hospital soon after and began a long road of treatment. And I cannot express in words how deeply sorry I am that that treatment evidently proved unsuccessful. Perhaps not the result of the VA or its doctors or its hospitals, because we are only beginning to learn as a country and society how to confront post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury with the specialized diagnosis and care that these diseases demand. Even in grief, we should not forget Justin's service to his country, his joy and his pride in that service. And he deserved both joy and pride, as well as his long-fought battle here at home. And I want to take this occasion to encourage anyone who is suffering from post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury or any of the other wounds of war to reach out for help. The Veterans Crisis Line is there to help you. Anyone who needs that help can call 1-800-273-TALK, T-A-L-K, 1-800-273-TALK. Courage is shown not only on the battlefield, but afterward, upon return, when an individual in need of help seeks it, as Justin did. And Justin's story also reminds us of the heroic caregivers who take care of our nation's veterans. We owe them thanks. People who dedicate their lives to helping those who have served. Joanna also deserves our thanks because she was there for Justin, by his side throughout his treatment. And she never gave up. She never relented. She never surrendered. She was his full-time caregiver, participating in the VA's caregiver program, and Justin himself continued to give back. I will never forget my conversations with him at that Marine Corps League event, afterward on the phone, by email and phone. Joanna is a strong advocate for all veterans, as we should be, all of us. She's studying psychology in college and hopes to go to law school. She wants to dedicate her life to being a veterans advocate, and I commend her and all of our military families, all of our military spouses who are there for their loved ones, and all of our families who seek to reach out. We need to keep faith with those veterans. We need to know and discover what will conquer the demons that often threaten to subdue our bravest and most selfless veterans when they come back, and to give them the courage and the strength they need to conquer these dreaded diseases that we ourselves have a complicity in creating. We have an obligation and an opportunity to do more, and we must keep faith and make sure that no veteran is left behind My heart and prayers go to Justin's family. And of course, I know that I am joined by all the members of this body, not only in grieving, but offering our help and service if there's anything we can do. Mr. President, Madam President, I would like to speak separately now on a topic that has been discussed by two of my colleagues this morning, the senior senator from Texas, Senator Cornyn, and the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Chairman Carl Levin. And I want to thank my colleagues like Senator Cornyn for joining me in raising a vital issue that must be addressed by this body and by Alan Estevez, a well-qualified nominee for the position of Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. I will vote for his confirmation today. And I believe that he is well qualified and has the credentials to perform with distinction in this role. And I hope that uppermost on his list of priorities will be the Mi-17 helicopter acquisition that is so misguided and wrong-headed in the way that it has been done by our own Department of Defense. Madam President, if you were to stop at Stella's Corner Restaurant on Main Street in Stratford for a lunch or a cup of coffee and ask the folks there, what do you expect from your government? I think one of the things they would say is that they expect the United States Congress and all of us here to keep our country safe. And when it comes to buying the equipment for our troops and allies, we should do so hands down, no doubt about it, buy American. Make it in America. Manufacture it in Connecticut or in the United States. Nothing could be more simple or straightforward. And yet somehow that Main Street common sense is simply ignored across the river in the United States Department of Defense, the Pentagon, where so many decisions are made. Since becoming a member of the Armed Services Committee, I've become aware that the Department of Defense committed almost $1 billion to provide Afghanistan a fleet of Mi-17 helicopters. Let me just repeat. Russian helicopters going to Afghanistan with American tax dollars and bought from the Russian export agency that at the same time is selling arms to Bashar Assad to kill his own people in Syria. Since 2005, the United States has been procuring Mi-17s to build the capacity of the Afghan military, and it's working toward a total fleet size of approximately 80 helicopters. The Afghan military had approximately 50 Mi-17s as of last year, and this year the Army awarded a $572 million contract to purchase another 30, with approximately 15 more to come per year to replace the aging helicopters that the Afghan military already has run into the ground and failed to maintain. That's right, the Afghan military has failed to maintain those helicopters we bought previously. And now you would think that something had been done to provide the maintenance capacity for these new helicopters, but the answer is no. The contract to award these helicopters was managed in a way to prevent any American helicopter companies from bidding on the work, even though the Department of Defense's own analysis in 2010 concluded that the Made in America, and I'm quoting, CH-47D Chinook helicopter is the most cost-effective, single-platform type fleet for the Afghan Air Force over a 20-year cycle, end of quote. Now, I acknowledge I may be partial to helicopters made in Connecticut. The best helicopters in the world are made in Connecticut by the Sikorsky employees who happen to stop at Stella's on Main Street for lunch or a cup of coffee, and I see them there all the time. And that H-92 troop transport helicopter of H-60 should also be considered by the Department of Defense for this mission. But at the end of the day, made in the USA ought to be the ruling principle. Made in the USA. American helicopters for the American military and American allies. In 2011, the Army contracted with the Russian state-owned arms export firm Russo-Boron Export. Yes, the very same Russo-Boron Export that arms our enemies in Iran and is a key enabler of Assad's ongoing slaughter of his own civilians in Syria. Women and children in Syria die by the arms provided by Russo-Boron Export, purchased by Assad with money financed by Russian banks and purchased from Russo-Boron Export. Well-documented crimes against humanity, war crimes that eventually should be prosecuted. And I am working with my colleague, Senator Ayotte, on legislation to strengthen the contracting provisions that prohibit, quote, contracting with the enemy. These purchases are, in effect, supporting enemy purchases. And yet before us is a glaring example of contracting with the enemy. We've all heard testimony that preventing mass atrocities in Syria was complicated by their air and naval defense systems that prevent the protection of civilians in Syria and threaten its neighbors in Turkey and Jordan. Where did those systems come from? The answer is Russo-Boron Export. The same systems that could shoot down our plane if we pursue additional measures against Syrian war crimes. The same entity that arms Iran, where we currently are seeking solutions against nuclear armament, and where we have said all options should be on the table in terms of our military action. The Department of Defense thinks the best thing for our long-term national security is to pay the Russian arms dealer that threatens global stability and our own freedom of action. But it gets worse, because without question, we've overpaid for these Russian helicopters. A general told me the best way to think about these helicopters is they are, quote, flying refrigerators that we never should have bought in the first place. We paid about $8 million a copy, while Russia sold other nations Mi-17s for $4 million each. What a bargain. Other countries buy each helicopter for $4 million. We pay $18 million. And it's still worse. The Army Acquisition Office that handled this contract is now under investigation for, quote, questionable transactions, including potentially improper payments to Russian companies involved in the repair of these helicopters, as well as problematic personal ties between the Army officials in this office and those foreign entities. Now, if I went to Stella's and I told this absolutely remarkable story, I am hoping that the folks there would have said, "No, you must be making this up. This couldn't happen in the United States Department of Defense. No way. in the United States of America. Not with our tax dollars, but in fact, it is all true, and I have tried to put it as objectively and dispassionately as possible, just the facts. And I suspect for anybody at Estevez who might have believed this incredible tale, they would have said, well, if a tenth of that is true, what are you going to do to stop it? What are you going to do to end this waste of taxpayers' money and insult and outrage to the American taxpayer? Well, we did something. At my urging and through the work of my colleagues who have spoken, including Senator Cornyn, Congress in the Defense Appropriations Act expressly prohibited the Department of Defense from spending any more taxpayer money on Russian helicopters and doing business with Russo-born export. And in fact, I wrote to the Secretary of Defense about this program. I've written numerous letters, and I have met with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Well, did that stop these purchases? No. The $500 million contract recently signed, recently completed, now underway by the United States Army for more Russian helicopters used previously appropriated funds to ignore the will of Congress. Clearly, the spirit and intent of the National Defense Authorization Act was to end these purchases, and the United States Department of Defense, in effect, has defied the will of Congress. So here we are today, almost $1 billion out the door, and the near certainty that these helicopters are going to be used to smuggle drugs, that's right, smuggle drugs, in Afghanistan. And that purchase has occurred. The contract's been completed. We can be sure that just as they failed to maintain those helicopters in the past, they will fail again in the future, because the Afghan National Security Forces doesn't have the people trained to maintain the helicopters. In fact, right now, it doesn't have the people trained to fly those helicopters. And in a few years, what the American taxpayer will have to show for this folly is rusted scrap heaps at Bagram Air Force Base. Now, I understand that some in the Pentagon started this program with good intentions. Their thinking may have been that the Afghans already had some of these helicopters in the process of standing up their capability to defend themselves. They ought to have a few more, and then the transition to a more capable helicopter. And I've heard from our generals that we need these helicopters because the Afghans know how to fly them. But the facts of the matter are that this program was never designed to be sustainable after we leave Afghanistan. And my hope is we will leave Afghanistan sooner rather than later. There is simply no transition place now or in the foreseeable future to buy American, to train those Afghan pilots how to fly American helicopters, how to maintain American helicopters. And when the Russians forced us to procure the helicopters from them directly, rather than excess helicopters from countries like the Czech Republic, we should have made a course correction immediately, even if we thought those kinds of helicopters were necessary in the short term. There were options and alternatives that should have been pursued, and they were not. And that's why I believe that the plan requested by the senior senator from Texas makes a lot of sense. He's asked the Department of Defense for an alternative plan for meeting the Afghan requirement. We can't walk away from a problem that we created. We can't walk away from the need for a transition. But there is a better way to get there. And the answer is very simply, buy American. Buy American helicopters. If they need helicopters, and there is a question whether they do, if all they're going to use them to perform is drug operations, and there is reliable information that the helicopters will be in fact used for drug smuggling and sales and illegal operations. But even if there is a legitimate need, even if there is a credible reason, buy American. I expect Mr. Estevez will be confirmed today. But I want to say to him, please, as one of your priorities, figure out a way to end these purchases from Russo-born export. You owe it to the members of this body, you owe it to the American people, to find a way to buy American and to keep faith with the brave men and women who will use the equipment that you will help purchase with taxpayer dollars. I know you take this responsibility seriously, and I hope that you will bring that seriousness of purpose to these issues, because they are important, not just to the military and not just to taxpayers, but most especially to the brave American women who wear the uniform of the United States of America. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Indiana.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Madam President, I've come to the floor many times